Hello everyone, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Great, good. Hi, yeah, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us for the final one of our webinar series. So the series is to share knowledge and experience in natural flood management and help researchers and practitioners build understanding in the field. Hi, I'm Gerard Stewart. I'm the Communications Coordinator for the research programme, and today we've got Joanna Clark, Barbara Percy and Emily Trill, who will be talking about land use and management for natural flood management. I can hear somebody talking in the background. Could you please everyone make sure your microphones are muted and your cameras are off to avoid distracting. Thanks very much. So I've got a couple of housekeeping points and a brief introduction, and I'll hand over to the Landwise team. So please do ask questions. You can use the chat function to do that, and we'll have 15 minutes or so at the end of the webinar to cover those. And some people have sent in questions or submitted them when they reserve their place, so we'll try and cover a couple of those as well if possible. The webinar is being recorded, so I need to let you know that for GDPR purposes. It will be available on our website shortly after we finish, and you can also access all the other webinars through the programme, and they'll be there to access from now on. So make use of that resource. There's a lot of excellent material there. So the NFM programme, it's a 4-year, £4 million programme funded by NERC, and we're carrying out novel science to improve our understanding of NFM where possible using quantification. We're looking at a range of NFM measures in different types of catchments, flooding scenarios and at different scales, and the aim is to improve evidence and understanding for policymakers and practitioners. There's 3 projects that make up the programme in geographically different parts of the country, and today we're going to hear from researchers in the Landwise project. A really key part of the research is drawing on the expertise of partners and engaging them in our work, and it's really critical to the success of the programme. And today, really, the webinar programme is part of that engagement process. And I think that's probably all I need to say. I think I'll hand over to Jo.
Okay, thanks, Gerard. Can you see our slides? Yep.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, so welcome everyone. So my name's Joanna Clark. I'm the Principal Investigator for the Landwise project, and today we're going to talk about specific parts of the project, focusing on field work, soils, and our web tool we've developed to explore these data, looking particularly at land use and management for natural flood management. So I'll be speaking, Emily will be speaking a bit later about the field work. She's done more of this work than I have. She's been out in the field making measurements, and Barbara, who's developed the web tool, will talk later. And we just want to acknowledge the other members of the team who aren't talking today but have contributed to the work we're presenting. These include researchers, but also farmers, farm advisors, people from government organisations and other places that have contributed to the knowledge that has helped us develop this work and collected soil samples in some situations. This is part of an even bigger team we have involved in the Landwise project. So we've got around 30 researchers and over 50 project partners across a range of organisations, and this recognises the kind of diverse interests that are involved in natural flood management and all the people who need to be involved in the conversation and the creation of knowledge if we're going to develop things that are useful for people to actually deliver NFM on the ground. So part one is me talking about an overview of the project. So we're working in the Thames Valley area, and this area has a long history of flooding dating back over 1,000 years. So this is some information we'd pulled out from the British Hydrological Society chronology of hydrological events, showing flooding over recent years. There's a kind of view that the flooding in 2007 or the flooding in 2013 were freak events and they're not going to happen again. Well, if you just look at the recent history, flooding has happened and it will continue to happen into the future. Flooding in this area happens from surface runoff, from rivers, and most importantly, we also need to acknowledge groundwater, because the Thames area is dominated by some permeable geology that aren't present in other parts of the country where a lot of NFM research has been undertaken. So if we look at this map here of the Thames Valley or West Thames area, it's the sort of rural headwaters of the Thames. It's a lowland catchment. There are no peatlands in the headwaters or the uplands. It's the maximum altitude is around 300 metres, and then the River Thames obviously goes through London and out to sea. The catchment's dominated by carbonate geologies. So this is chalk and limestone, so very permeable, very shallow soils developing on these geologies. And then we've got in the areas around the River Thames itself, on the floodplain, we've got mudstones and sort of clay, loamy clay geologies, flat land as well. It's quite different, contrasting material, and there's some areas of sandstone as well associated with heathland. Within this area, we've been focusing intensely on the Loddon, the Pang and the Upper Thames, but also looking at the Kennet, the South Chilterns, the York, and some kind of bigger scaling work around the Cotswolds there. So we're working at multiple scales here, from sort of field to small catchment to larger catchment within the region. If you think of NFM options generally into sort of three categories, you have the first category, which is looking at infiltration and below ground water storage. The second category, looking at slowing the flow of water from hill slope to river. And option 3 is slowing and storing water on floodplains. With Landwise, we're really focusing on option 1. So we're looking at infiltration and below ground water storage within the catchment in the fields themselves. So we've got 3 research questions. So the first one is looking at how effective different land-based measures are at increasing infiltration, evaporative losses and below ground water storage in different locations in lowland catchments, thinking about these different types of soil we mentioned. Question 2 is how effective these different measures vary seasonally and between years with respect to antecedent conditions, and different types of precipitation, magnitude and duration. And the final question is about scaling. So how effective are these different measures at delivering catchment-wide water storage and infiltration, and thereby reducing runoff rates compared to more targeted approaches, like, for instance, leaky barriers across different scales. So we're thinking of now going from the small field, less than kilometre square, to the larger catchments, 100 to 8,000 kilometre square is actually the size of the map I showed earlier, the whole West Thames area. So the project is split into 6 work packages. Work package 1 is looking at using local knowledge and technical data to create scenarios. Work package 2 is around making measurements in the field. Work package 3 is around making measurements using satellites and remote sensing data. And all these 3 different types of knowledges and data sources will be integrated into Work Package 4, where we're using different types of models run at different scales and different levels of complexity to test these different ideas. And then these data are being put into a web app so people can view and interrogate the data and see the graphs they want to see, not the ones that we think they should see. So there's a bit more opportunity to explore what we've created. But just to summarise, this is a huge project, so we're not covering everything in this webinar. You can breathe a sigh of relief with that. We're not going to bombard you with everything. And in fact, a large part of this work has already been covered in previous webinars. So just to flag up, there was a webinar on the local knowledge and scenarios last year, March 2020, by Angie Owen and Chris Short. So the recording for that is available. Wilma Slanker gave a webinar in May this year on the remote sensing and those technologies looking at radar and soil moisture. And there was a webinar in July looking at the different approaches to modelling as well. So what we're focusing on today is the field work, so measurements in the field, the web tool, and drawing on a couple of small bits of information from Work Package 1 and Work Package 4. So what knowledge? We talk about knowledge and evidence, but what is that? And what is it that we need to make a decision? And that often depends on who we are. And I think quite often there's an assumption what we need is graphs and technical knowledge, but the community itself is very diverse and there's lots of different types of evidence out there that we can use. And this is kind of acknowledging this is part of acknowledging a kind of shifting culture within research to move from a sort of knowledge transfer model, which is the idea where the researchers have all the knowledge and then they impart their wisdom onto the research users who are grateful for that knowledge and then apply it, which is kind of an unrealistic model. It's not how things work in reality. We want a more natural model, which is more based on knowledge exchange, sort of known as a dialogue model, where we have more conversations between people who work in research organisations and have like the expert badge, if you like, because they spend more of their day doing research type projects, working with research partners who are using this knowledge, but may also be doing their own bits of research as well, and so have a different and more broader knowledge base to draw on. So a way of illustrating this approach that we try to take in Landwise, sort of how to integrate different knowledges and experiences, is conceptualized here. I think someone needs to mute themselves. Right. There's a model proposed by Barrios et al. Where we look at the sort of shared knowledge systems. So if you think scientists have some knowledge and farmers have some knowledge, and there'll be core concepts they share, but they'll also know more about, scientists will know more about some things and farmers will know more about the others. And if we can actually bring this together, we have a much bigger shared knowledge system. And so here we have a photograph here taken on the lawn outside the CEH building in Wallingford, where we have a team of farmers, farm advisors and scientists getting together to co-design the field survey that Emily is going to talk about later. And we were there sharing our knowledge on how we collected soil and even how we talked about soil. And one of the useful things that came out of this conversation was actually the language around soil. So as a scientist, we're kind of drawn towards the soil survey of England and Wales higher categories. We talk about clay soils, brown soils, lithomorphic soils. And if we're using the soil series data, you've got Wickham, Hurst, the kind of names where these profiles were described. And these are all very technical. And this actual whole classification system of association and series is a bit bamboozling either from some researchers. So it requires quite a lot of detailed knowledge to access. And so through our conversations, there was a general feeling that this was a bit of a barrier to engagement across the wider project, and we should look at using soilscapes, which is essentially a reclassification of the same data by Cranfield, using more lay terminologies that describe soils based on their drainage, their texture, and their pH. And so this is what we used to underpin our soil survey, and Emily will show some maps later. What also came out through these conversations, the farmers said that this is all too complicated, and what we should really use is RB209, which is actually the language used in the fertiliser, ADHP fertiliser guidance, because that's what farmers know and use every day, these shallow soils, medium soils, deep soils, and this will be the way to engage. And that was a good comment. Initially, earlier in the project, we were like, oh, but we need to know about the hydrology, and all these other terms really matter to us. So we designed a series of surveys and sent them out to farmers using the soilscapes classes, and we had some response, but a limited response. And then there was a comment around the soils were just too complicated, and then we changed it to RB209 and got a much better response. And I guess that's a lesson for us as researchers, and although the complexity we felt was important to us, it didn't actually help us engage and have this conversation with farmers because it was meaningless to them, and we needed to talk to them on their language and their terms, so RB209. So using these RB209 reclassifications, we asked around a range of management practices. Just give an example here about tillage, because tillage is often referred to in relation to NFM, just to understand what type of things farmers were doing on the heavy clay soils. So thinking about the mudstones compared to the medium soils and the shallow sandy, and these are the ones on the carbonate geologies. So you can kind of translate them across. And effectively, we had mixed tillage. So that's a mixture of different types of tillage. So direct drilling, so no ploughing, reduced tillage, where you might just scrape the surface, and conventional tillage, which is where you plough. So people were doing mixed tillage in all soil types. People were doing reduced tillage in all soil types, and also zero tillage. But what was absent was there was no ploughing going on the loamy soils on the chalk. So there was a slight difference in tillage practices, but there was a lot of commonality across different soil types. We found a range of different farming systems in this area. You can't classify farming as one different type of farming, and that's important when we start thinking about land management and what it means. And also, farming is not just, do I have cover crops or not? It's actually farming as part of a system, and you can kind of broadly group farming systems into kind of conventional, intensive, where the focus is on yield and there's use of chemicals and artificial inputs. Regenerative, where the focus is actually on profit, not yield, and the focus is on soil health and trying to reduce the use of chemicals. And then you've got organic farming, where the focus is again on profit, not yield, and it's on building soil health, but there's no chemicals used, and this is actually certifiable by the Soil Association. And so using these kind of three different types of farming systems and the information we got from the field survey and the interviews and the kind of online survey we did, we're able to better understand how farmers are using and managing soils in these different farming systems across the catchment, what it's looked like in terms of rotations and crops grown, who had the grass lays. Turns out the organic farmers are the ones mainly with the grass lays, who was doing different types of tillage, what sort of amendments were being applied. So we've got this sense of pattern of how land's being used and managed in this work. At the moment, we've got paper in preparation at the moment to submit, looking at all these different scenarios and storylines that we fed into the modelling. They're also linked to the analysis that we did in the fieldwork. And on that note, I'm going to now hand over to Emily to pick up and talk you through the fieldwork. You muted, Emily.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's good. We can hear you now.
Okay, sorry about that. Hi everyone. So as Joe introduced, I'm Emily Trill from UKCH, and I've been working on the fieldwork package with many of those partners that Joe introduced earlier. So today I'll just take you through some of the concepts, methods, and some preliminary findings of the fieldwork before Barbara talks about the next step in exploring these data online. So we've undertaken 2 complementary surveys, a broad-scale survey with high replication of surface soil property measurements over 150 fields to quantify how land use impacts these near-surface soil properties and the effect on water infiltration and storage. And we've just completed a more detailed survey across 3 locations and 7 fields to capture the field scale heterogeneity under different land-based NFM measures with greater spatial and temporal detail than the broad-scale survey. Here you can see some of those differences between the 2 surveys. The broad-scale sampled 154 fields over 45 farms across the West Thames catchment, once each over 2019 to 2020. We measured these soil properties in the top 50 mil of soil: bulk density, texture, structure, and organic matter, whereas the detailed survey focused on 3 sites that were sampled over 2021 in the spring before harvest and after harvest to capture changes over an annual cycle. This survey focused on more soil water properties that change over time, including infiltration, soil water, and surface roughness, with increased measurements made over depth. So in this map, the yellow dots show the distribution of the broad-scale sampling locations across the West Thames catchment, from upstream of Maidenhead to the Cotswolds headwaters, covering chalk, limestone, and mudstone geologies that Joe described earlier, and the 5 generalised soil types that she also went into, comparing those 3 types of RB209 classification of heavy, medium, and shallow soils. The detailed survey locations are those circled in purple in the Upper Thames and Ock catchments. So this table just shows the broad-scale survey classification of fields sampled across those 5 generalised soil types and the underlying geologies, and the number of fields sampled across those 4 different land uses investigated. So we looked at arable land with grass in rotation, arable without grass in rotation, permanent grassland, and broadleaf woodland. This sampling strategy enabled us to cover land use variability within fields, which is between fields, which is across the boxes, and then within fields, in-field variability, which is within each box as well. The aim was to have 8 fields in each box to give us robust stats, but as you can see, we didn't quite get there due to limited availability of arable fields with grass rotations on the impeded drainage and floodplains, as well as a time-consuming but robust protocol and delays from extreme weather, which meant that we didn't quite get to sample all the fields planned, accounting for some of those green boxes. And the detailed survey locations fall into those classes circled in purple, where we compared 3 arable fields in the Cotswolds on shallow soils over limestone, 1 field with grass in rotation, 1 with a rye and clover rotation, and 1 with a herbal ley rotation. We also compared 2 arable fields near Wantage on free draining loamy soils over chalk, comparing fields with conventional management to controlled traffic. And finally, we compared permanent grassland to broadleaf woodland on slowly permeable soil over mudstone. This slide just shows how our sampling methodology captured that within box or within field variability using an arable field example. So we took samples from the untrafficked or uncultivated margins, the trafficked headlands or tramlines, and from the representative infield areas. At grassland sites with no margins, we only took 10 samples, 5 from the trafficked and 5 from the infield. And at woodland sites, we took 1 composite sample for organic matter analysis, as well as 6 samples for mineral soils, or 12 if there was a deep organic surface layer as well. broad scale survey was sampled in this walking W shape to capture variability across the field, while the detailed survey sampling was carried out along 2 parallel 20-metre transects 30 metres apart to complement an electrical resistivity tomography transect in between them. And throughout both surveys, we avoided any unrepresentative areas like the overly trafficked gateways that only take up a very small area. Here are some photos of those measurements taken at each of the sampling points. So in the broad scale survey, we took a VES, or visual estimation of soil structure, which is top left, at each of the infield trafficked and untrafficked sampling point per field. And then we took 2 surface soil samples, one of which was analysed for volumetric water content and bulk density, and then the other for slaking dispersion, soil organic matter content, and hand and laser particle size analysis. While the broad scale survey focused on high replication of soil property measurements in the top 50 mil, the detailed survey sampled 5 depths between the surface and 1 metre for bulk density and organic matter analysis. We looked at soil horizons and vegetation root depth recorded over the top 1 metre, which is that bottom right gouge auger, and then we looked at soil saturated conductivity at 25 and 45 centimetres below ground level using Guelph permeameters, which is second from the left on the bottom, and surface infiltration measurements were taken using the mini disc infiltrometers. So here you can see why it was so important to capture that variability of surface conditions with high replication of surface measurements in the broad scale survey. You can see the compaction and runoff pathways through the traffic tram lines, and then resulting in saturated near surface soil, but the soil just below the surface was unsaturated, showing that the soil still had capacity to absorb water and increase flood storage, but it wasn't getting through due to the land management and the surface soil properties. So the next few slides demonstrate some of the mixed effect modelling that Joe's been doing on the broad scale data, and I'll give you some of the key preliminary results so far. So this just explains what goes into the models. So for a given response, it will be determined by the contributing fixed effects, random effects, covariates and errors. So for the bulk density response that I'll show in the next slide, you can see that the fixed effects include the 5 generalized soil types shown earlier, the 4 land use classes of arable with and without grass, the permanent grass and the woodland, as well as the with infill classes of infill trafficked and untrafficked areas. The random effects include things like the farm, field, researcher, farming system and grass mix, and the covariates include soil organic matter content from loss on ignition and the clay content. So this shows some of the random effects under the land use categories. So for arable fields, whether they're conventional or organic, min-till, controlled traffic, if they have a buffer strip, use cover crops or organic amendments, and what the crop rotation is. If the arable field has a grass rotation, the random effects include the same as permanent grassland, taking into account the grass mix and livestock management, while woodland random effects include the management and age. So here's some of the results from a mixed effect model run for bulk density, run with these previously described parameters of land use, soil within field. So these accounted for 76.8% of variance with all terms significant. And we can see from this that the bulk density in arable fields is similar with and without grass rotations, as well as the similarity between the grassland and woodland bulk density. While the soil classes on the right there show that bulk density is slightly higher for the more freely draining soils than the heavier clay soils. So both land use and soil class showed a significant effect on bulk density in the surface layer, but there's a greater effect of land use than soil type, which is important in demonstrating the potential for land management NFM measures in manipulating soil properties and increased water storage. So in this mixed effects model, we using the log organic matter, we see a significant correlation between organic matter and bulk density, with reduced bulk density with increased organic matter. And because organic matter affects soil structure through aggregate formation, root networks, and by feeding and supporting soil biology that helps create aggregates and maintain good soil structure. So in the model, the F value indicated that, again, land use explained more variation than the soil type, although both were significant terms again. And you can see from the differences between the groups on the box plots on the right that there are larger differences for land use than soil type. You can also see that organic matter was significantly higher in woodlands on the right than the grassland, then arable with grass and without grass in fields on the same soil types. So again, this correlation is really exciting for NFM because soil organic matter can be controlled both through land use and management practices, whereas soil type can't be. There's also the added benefit of carbon sequestration in soils and contribution to net zero. And that's it for me. So I'll pass you over to Barbara to show you around the web tool.
Hi. Yeah, I know nothing about any of this science, so no tricky questions, please. But I've been involved in producing the website for not just looking at the field survey data, but also for looking at all the other interesting results from all the different other work packages. So the community outreach and workshops within catchments, and where they talked about the acceptability and feasibility of the different measure implementations. What else have we done? There's been modelling results that have started to come in, so we're starting to visualise those. So that's the kind of thing I've been doing. So I will take you virtually into the world of the website, partly because never work with children, animals and the internet. I'm sort of a bit reluctant to test Teams and swapping between the Teams meeting and the real website. So we'll pretend we're going into the website, and this is the homepage. And because there is so many different things to look at, we've split them up into 3 pathways, and it depends on the kind of person you are and what you want to find out as to which pathway you might want to take. So for this soil field survey and soil data, we're looking at the farmer landover route, and within that we've got different cards, shall we say, that you can click on. So there's basic stuff, so you can click on and find out about the different NFM measures, and you can find out about the project, and there's links to other resources. But if we look at the soil surveys, and I've just started literally to play with the data that's available. So at the moment it's just a conceptual thing of the kinds of things that we'll be able to let you look at and play with. I've not even looked at the possibility of comparing different rotations, for example, but this is just the data as is. You see, you can select different locations. You can select infield or the headland or the woodland, what your soil type might be. We get some graphs, and in this instance, I've converted the free text vegetation data into some sort of consistent grouping, whereby grasses and things like that are the green end and actual crops are at the yellow end. So it's a nice sort of quick visual cue that infield, the grasses obviously have higher values and the crops have, maybe that's reasonable, I'm not sure, but this is, as I say, this is the starting point. This is really a proof of concept and a discovery of the kinds of things we could visualize, and this will then be discussed amongst the team to work out with our project partners as to what kinds of things would actually be useful, not just what we think might be useful. Another option was comparing the different metrics that we've got and see if there's correlation. A third, well, let's look at a single field. What's the difference between the different metrics in different parts of the field? So you see sort of the headland and the infield and the margin and the tram lines. And we can sort that and show it in different ways. Going on, then okay, let's see a lot of fields. So that's the kind of thing we can do, and if I have time in a moment, I will look to see whether it's worth trying the website. I can always accidentally kick you all out of the meeting. What's the worst can happen. So while we're here, let's have a look at the 1D modelling. This is so much data coming out of the 1D modelling. We've not yet had anything about the flood modelling, but we're expecting to be able to build a similar set of tools once we get data from that as well. So in this instance, you pick some basic criteria, and in the first visualization that you can see is an animation. You can actually run it, or you can run your finger up and down the slider. So throughout the year, and in this case, we're talking about the hydrological year, which is October to beginning of October to the end of September, rather than the calendar year, because that's actually more meaningful. And you can see how wet or dry the soil becomes from the top right the way down through to 1.5 meters or whatever that is relevant to the soil that's being looked at. A couple of drops there say it rained that day, so it's pinged away off to that. It's getting a bit wet, which is quite interesting. For the same year, you can then sort of see how the water balance, so how much has come in rain and snow, how much has gone away, how much has been lost due to either evaporation or runoff or infiltration, and then you can see the balance. And I thought when I looked at this originally, I thought that's really spooky. If you look at any year, it's really at the end of the year, it's almost balanced. And I thought, well, yeah, of course it is, you stupid girl, because otherwise we just get wetter and wetter or drier and drier. So yeah. So you can see this is actually quite a wet year. At no point, or very few points, did it actually get any way dry. That's kind of interesting. I don't know if people have memories of this year, but yeah, it's quite a wet year. And a nice thing that we can do is actually compare it. So either comparing with putting a different land use for the same soil, or the same, just out of curiosity value, what if I had different soil but was doing it the same crop rotation or the same land use, what would that mean? And you can see the difference between here, sort of quite a difference between having, and I apologise because this is tiny on my screen, but I think it's the difference between whether there was woodland or whether it's arable, or grass, permanent grass or arable. What else can we look at? We can actually look at, this is the daily, the previous one was cumulative for the year, so you can actually look day on day, and you can sort of switch some of the lines off, so you can actually see how much of it is modelled as being run off rather than, and highlight different parts of it. Another thing we can look at is, this is water content capacity. So the more colour you see, the more capacity the soil has to take in more water. And so in winter, where the soils are normally wet, there's very little capacity for more. And in the summer months, and again down here, that looks very wet. And spookily enough, I think that's the year we've been talking about, that we've seen for the others. if I zoom in, let's see a bit more detail. That's sort of more normal summer. And we've had a few years where it's actually obviously been quite wet. And I think they will find they will coincide with some of the flooding events we've had. And again, we can compare. So different land use, what difference would it make? And all of a sudden, there's more capacity for more water storage just by changing the land use. So this is the kind of thing you can take away just by playing and clicking different buttons and examining what we're doing, what you're doing now, comparing it with what you could do, just generally sort of playing to see what differences it could make. And yeah, I'm waffling because I'm out of my comfort zone now. Joe, do you want to take it back?
Thanks, Barbara. I think that was a nice summary. That was just how people can just explore the data that's in the tool and actually look at information beyond what we've shown and what we're going to show in reports. And I guess that probably brings us to the end here. We were told, given quite strong guidance by Gerard, not to overrun our speaking time and allow time for discussion and questions. So we'd welcome any comments or reflections or things that people would like to share with us. I would note that a lot of the fieldwork Emily's presenting, this is literally just coming towards the end in the last few weeks. And we set the date for this webinar last year, or maybe it was before COVID, thinking we'd have everything finished by now. And we've had quite a lot of delays due to COVID. So this is kind of a reflection of where we are now. So there will be more to show next year. There's a finale event for the whole programme that will be presented next year that Gerard has the details of and we'll share later. But thank you very much for your attention and very interested to hear from others on their views.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. There's a few questions coming in now. There's a couple on the web tool, so perhaps we'll let Barbara look at those. But we did have in the meantime, perhaps I could ask one of the questions that was sent in before the webinar, and that is, do you think the temporal variability of soil hydraulic properties may outweigh or mask the benefits of land use / management practices?
Oh, Emily, did you want to have a go at that?
I think, yeah. Well, they're linked. So
You're quite quiet now, Emily. I don't know if your mic's moved or.
yes, it has.
Oh, that'd be it.
That better. Yeah. So obviously they are linked, and as we showed from Joe's model runs, the land use was more significant than the soil type. But obviously it does depend on antecedent condition and the land use and management. So obviously, if there is compaction, then that will affect the infiltration, but then that will vary throughout the year with the processes throughout farming, with ploughing and those sorts of practices.
I think we discussed this question earlier because it was one that's submitted. It's a really good question. I think Emily will be able to test this with her infiltration data you've taken this year, won't you? I think with the soil properties in terms of bulk density, we found that actually land use and management is more significant than soil type. But when you look at the temporal variation in things like infiltration and soil moisture, I think jury's still out on that one. I think we need to work at the data and have a look. I know Will's also been looking at this relationship between variation in soil moisture in relation to land management, and that work's ongoing, so that's using the satellite data. But I think from my own personal perspective, I was expecting soils to come out as the king driver of everything, and I've been quite surprised how much more significant land use and management is. And I think you have to consider that within this catchment area, we're talking about a narrowish group of mineral soils. They aren't organic soils. It isn't the full range of soils in the UK. It's the soils in the Thames catchment. Although I will say within that narrowish group, there is freely draining soils, the kind of heavy clays that aren't so draining. So there is some variation, but it goes to show, kind of highlights the importance of land use and the input of organic matter into the soils, really. So that's my thoughts on it. If anyone wants to comment in the chat on this, I'm keen to.
I just saw somebody turn their camera on. I was wondering if they might be going to say something, but no. Okay. Yeah, if you do have thoughts on that, do add them to the chat. So yeah, Barbara, there's a few questions on the visualization tool, and I suppose with the future implementation of that, Joe may wish to comment as well. But can you see those, Barbara, rather than me just reading them out? Perhaps.
Yeah.
You want to pick up on them?
Yeah, that's fine. The first one is it all model data that can be explored, or are measurements available to look at as well? The intention is, well, obviously the full surveys are there as measurements, so they will be explorable. And the intention, well, obviously we have the 1D model data, and the hope is to be able to get the flood modelling data in as well. So the intention is, and the hope is, that we will have all the data available, which also links to a later question about users being able to download portions of the raw data. I think that is still currently under discussion.
I think some of the data will be downloadable because we collected it, and it will be lodged on EIDC, so the NERC data portal. Some of it won't be because of if it's using certain data sets that have a license requirement to them, we'd have to restrict that. So that's things linked.
Yeah. So I think the intention is that we will make data available where we have the license to be able, it's ours, or we have the license to make it available. So that there will be that facility in, or that's the anticipation. So that's, I hope that answers those questions. I will answer the one about how much data cleaning was needed. In the main, very little. I say the main thing, that the one from the soil surveys was the free format vegetation, and that was a semi-programmatic manual combination, in that you sort of programmatically try and strip out the first vegetation and then try and map that to something that is in one of the groups of to reduce the list. Otherwise there were a lot. And I mean that process might yet change once we actually discuss the results of the surveys, and we might actually sort of fiddle with that a bit more, make it a bit more robust. But in the main, there's been very little data cleaning from the front end, from producing the website. How much has been done in the back end by the data gatherers and the model runs, that's for them to answer. I noticed there's a question as well about, which is probably for Joe, how much has the model been informed by the field campaigns? And I think that's probably the best one for Joe to take off.
I think basically the modelers have been using the Cranfield soil data so far, and some kind of sensitivity analysis type perturbations of changing parameters by 10 or 5%. I think the field data, as in almost every project, the field work is delayed, and it's been extra specially delayed by COVID here. So the data hasn't been available for the modelers to use. But I think for the one-dimensional field scale modelling, there is a plan to try and use that field data maybe later, but that wouldn't be till next year, and that might actually be after the end of Barbara's time on the project. So it might not make it into the web tool, but it might make it into a science publication. I think, yeah, that's just one of the unfortunate realities of trying to get fieldwork and modelling to line up. I think many people would probably share problems from other projects on that point. There's one comment I saw just popped up from Ali. Ali, you've got your camera on. Did you mean to?
Yeah, that's okay. Shall I turn it off? Is it using too much bandwidth or something?
Oh, well, it was just whether you wanted to say something because everyone else has got their camera off. That was all.
No, I was just yeah, the internet went down, so I came back. So I was just looking at the I thought the website looked really, really good, but some of the axes I'm thinking, oh, what does that mean? Like that, I was thinking the one that was like volume of soil moisture centimeters cubed for centimeters cubed, and I think that means how much water can the soil hold. So I don't know if that's what it does mean, but I don't know if it's worth, if there's any, you know, sort of turning the axes into something that is sort of more understandable, more sort of active, rather than like the unit. You know what the unit is, but it kind of like it. If you turn that into how much, so you understand what it means more. When if it can hold more water, that's good. If it can hold less water, that's bad.
Yes, I think adding more help generally dotted around, and for the scientists among the audience, they would want the axes labelled accurately.
Yeah.
But yes, like me saying for that graph, the more colour you can see, the more water the soil can take. That's the kind of level of visualisation I would prefer to get to.
Yeah.
Something that's a bit more, as you say, digestible by us mere mortals, rather than being a scientist and understanding immediately what centimetre cubes per centimetre cube means. And yes.
Yeah,
yes,
the harder you have to work at your brain, the kind of less likely are you, for me anyway, to take it in.
Yes, the intention is to add more help and improve those visualizations to make it more, readily digestible. Yeah.
Cool.
Joe, I think you spotted another question to pick up on.
Yeah, there was a good question here from Gareth Folks about, as a regenerative farmer, I would be interested to know how far these practices can influence NFM. So I think generally, my understanding of regenerative farming, and we've had a lot of discussions about what is regenerative farming, how do you classify regenerative farming, when is it not regenerative, and when is it conventional. So my understanding is the focus is on soils and soil health and rebuilding, looking after the land. And so anything you're doing to improve soil structure and build organic matter is going to be beneficial for natural flood management. And the reasons for that is soil structure, anything that helps water sink into the ground. So that's by creating these pore networks. So things with deep roots in, keeping the land surface covered, so the surface of the soil isn't destroyed by the active raindrops and causing a crust. That helps with the infiltration, and also feeding with organic matter. You're feeding the biology and the earthworms that actually help to create the soil aggregates and these crumbly structures that allow the water to sink through. So you've got helping infiltration, and then you've also got like organic matter itself can actually help hold on to water and retain it as well. So all of those practices are, I'd say, they're beneficial for NFM. I mean, what we've been trying to do in the project is quantify the degree to which they're beneficial and which ones are more significant than others. So that's where this mixed effect modelling will dig into it in a bit more detail and whether they have more effect on certain soil types or others. So I think we probably say watch this space on that one. But I think that's a good question and an interesting point. I mean, these practices are beneficial for other things like water quality management as well. So I probably noticed that.
Was there anything else there that you'd like to pick up on, or shall I pick one?
Yeah, you can pick one.
Okay, so Chris Utley has asked, do you take into account the age of any particular land use? So how many years a particular field or portion of field has been used in that way, e.g. tram lines? So how many years of changed use does it take to achieve a change that would be relevant to reducing flood risk?
That's a really good question. And that's the reason why we did a survey of real fields and we didn't run an experiment. Because if we set up a field experiment on our university farm, we would only be able to run it for 1 or 2 years. And that might be long enough. That might not be long enough to see realistic changes in soil structure. And also it wouldn't be done at the right scale because it would be done at a plot scale and not at field scale. And I've also had conversations with farmers when they've actually criticised the management skills of researchers, saying that some of our, experimental plots aren't managed as well as some fields are by real farmers. So that was the reason why we did a survey. We wanted to go out and look in real fields that have been managed in a certain way. I think the thing is, land use and management is quite dynamic. So I don't know that we actually collected the age in terms of the number of years that was being carried out. I think we do have that information for the detailed survey Emily has spoken of, and it's over, I think it's 5 to 7 years, isn't it, at least, in these different management systems. But that's a good thing for someone else to pick up, I think, maybe with a chronosequence, looking at how long do you actually have to have a certain type of management to deliver a certain type of effect, and whether that depends on soils. So it's a good question. We've tried to look at, like I said, we've tried to look at sort of medium to established systems, if you like, rather than new and emerging in our study. So I hope that answers what you were looking for, Chris.
We've probably only got time for one more, actually. So Evelyn has asked, what magnitude of percentage difference is seen with different types of land management? Sounds like a tricky one.
So that's percentage difference in, yeah, so we haven't worked through the data for that yet. We've done the sort of crude analysis. We've had a few errors to resolve, but that is what we want to do. So that will be coming in future. So if you come to the sort of webinar next July, or if you sign up for our newsletter or drop us an email, we can keep you in touch with the progress on that work. But that's a very good question, and that's something that we want to know the answer to too.
Okay, well, thanks. We've only got 2 minutes left, so I think we better wrap up. And I've got a couple of things to say before we say farewell. Oh, good. Yeah, if you do have any feedback or questions, please do get in touch. If we didn't have it, get around to your question, apologies, but there's contact details below, and Joe and the team will be happy to respond to questions. As I mentioned earlier, the recording will be available on the website alongside, I think there's 25 webinars in total, so you can access all of those on our website. The link's in the chat, posted that earlier. You can also sign up for our newsletter. Again, the link's in the chat, and access back issues if you want to keep in touch with what we're up to. And an important date for your diaries next year, the 7th of July, we have a finale event. So the details are still being put together for that, but we'd love to welcome you there. That's on online and in person. Is it Joe? Is it face to face?
No, the finales. So this finale is
online.
online.
Sorry. Yes, just online. Okay, sorry. Yeah,
it's just an online. I think the face to face, we were planning to join the British Hydrological Society meeting in September 2022, for a more interactive session. For Landwise, we have a project finale on the 8th of June, but that will just be Landwise. The 7th of July will cover Protect and QNFM as well.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, and just remains to say thanks very much to Joe, Emily and Barbara for excellent presentations and spot on with timing. Thank you all for joining us and for your questions, and thanks for supporting the webinar series. So cheerio.